The Charlotte Ledger Podcast is a member of the Queen City Podcast Network.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Banks, a staff writer for the Charlotte Ledger, and you're listening to the Charlotte Ledger Podcast. For more information, visit thecharlotteledger.com. Today's episode is hosted by Jim Morrill. Jim is a respected longtime political reporter in North Carolina, and he was with the Charlotte Observer for more than 30 years before retiring in 2021. On this episode, Jim is sitting down with Carter Wrenn. Carter is a Republican political consultant based in Raleigh. He worked for the campaigns of U.S. Senator Jesse Helms and Ronald Reagan in the 1970s, and recently, Carter has written a book called The Trail of the Serpent: Stories from the Smoke-Filled Rooms of Politics. Without further ado, Jim and Carter.
Hi, I'm Jim Morrill. Today we're talking to Carter Wrenn. Carter spans 5 decades of North Carolina politics. He was a senior advisor to Senator Jesse Helms and helped 2 other Republicans get elected to the Senate. He helped create a political organization for Helms called the National Congressional Club that introduced methods of fundraising, voter outreach, and advertising still in use today. Now Carter writes a blog with Democrat Gary Pierce, a one-time foe, and it's called Talking About Politics. He's just written a book that recounts some of his work on behalf of Helms and Ronald Reagan and others. It's called The Trail of the Serpent. Carter, welcome to the Ledger Podcast.
Thank you, Jim. It's good to be here.
Carter, first, I wonder if you could talk about how politics, and specifically Republican politics, has changed since you started working for Senator Helms in the early 1970s. I think you were 22 years old, and a lot of water's gone under the bridge since then. How do you think it's changed generally?
Politics has always been rough and tumble, and it's been an ongoing battle. But when I started out in politics, in Watergate, I started just after Watergate, and Nixon won in a landslide in 1972, and then got caught on tape telling a lie about his role in Watergate and had to resign. And that's one example of a big change. It used to be, for years it was, politicians were afraid to tell lies because they paid a price. People didn't approve of that. And that's changed today. You hear politicians telling tales all the time, and a lot of times people cheer them. They don't care. So I think the change there is not just the politicians. It's how people look at things like lies and brags and boasts, and things they vote against you, they don't anymore.
And that seems to predate the era of the current president. When do you think that started?
Well, I think that during the Cold War, a lot of people, in the World War II veterans particularly, felt fear. We were facing a foreign threat that was a bad threat. After that went away, I think the country started changing. And I think it finally, in about the time Trump ran the first time, it reached the point where it just tipped over the edge and became dishonesty, not telling the truth. It became an accepted practice in politics. Before that, you saw more of it than you used to, but it wasn't accepted. All of a sudden, boom, it was fine.
I think you could make some comparisons between Jesse Helms, who you started working for, and President Trump. Both were populist, both appealed to a lot of people, just a lot of people they won. I wonder if you could talk about if you think Helms foreshadowed the age of Trump at all.
Well, they certainly were both populist, and they were talking to working people, and that was a big part of their base. On the other hand, Jesse, like most politicians back then, he saw lies as a problem. He wasn't a perpetual liar. He wasn't, nobody could be completely honest, politics or not in politics, but he didn't embrace spinning lies. And that's a change. So yes, they had some things in common, but on the other hand, they had major differences too.
You talk a lot in the book, understandably, about the National Congressional Club, and that was the organization that you helped start back in the 70s. And it was originally formed to retire Jesse Helms' campaign debt, which at the time, I was surprised to find out was only $213,000, which Doesn't seem like a lot anymore, but the club became a lot more than that. It became a pioneer in the use of direct mail and TV advertising. I wonder if you could just talk about how it evolved over the years that you were involved.
Well, when Jesse ran the first time, about 2 months before the election, Arthur Finkelstein, the guy that did the polling, he took a poll and he told, to everybody's shock, Jesse was running 25, 30 points behind Nixon. And Arthur told Tom Ellis, you need to do ads to close that gap. And Mr. Ellis said, how much would it cost? Arthur said, around $200,000. Well, the campaign didn't have $200,000, not even close to it. But there was a man named Hugh Chatham from Elkin, North Carolina, and he was in the room listening. And he called Tom Ellis a couple of days later and said, I've gone to the bank and arranged a loan for $200,000 to your campaign. And if you win, Jesse wins, you pay me back. And if he loses, you don't have to. And that was how Jesse won that $200,000 in ads. And the Congressional Club was founded to pay that debt off. And 2 years later, I started working for the club. They still owed $190,000. And in 1975, Reagan came to North Carolina to do a fundraiser for Jesse to raise money for the debt. And Charlie Black, who worked with Jesse then,
who went on to become National Republican chairman.
Executive director.
Okay.
He's led a lot of campaigns over the years. He came to Raleigh and told Tom Ellis that Richard Viguerie, who was the direct mail genius, said he could raise $200,000 by sending out mailing. So that sounded sort of crazy, but Tom Ellis said, well, if he can do that, it'd be the best thing since sliced bread. So we did both. In 1975, we did the Reagan dinner, and that raised $250,000. And Viguerie sent out mail. And I remember one day this post office truck pulled up to the office, and it was packed full of envelopes with $10 and $15 and $25 checks in it. And I had to hire half a dozen women to open them and put them in the bank. But that raised $250,000. So we went from 200 in debt to 300 in the black in a series of a couple of months. And then Reagan ran for president.
I remember in your book, you said, you quote Tom Ellis saying it was like a miracle, a little bit like turning water into wine.
Well,
all you had to do is send out letters and money came pouring back.
Well, his comment was that he turned paper into cash. That's pretty amazing. And when Jesse ran the first time in 1978, that's when we really went into direct mail in a huge way. And we raised, and bear in mind, these are people all over the country that are giving. It's not just people in North Carolina. It's conservatives in California. We had more donors from California than North Carolina. And we raised something like $8 million before it was all said and done. And that was more than ever been raised in a Senate campaign. And after that, I think we raised $20 million in 84 and $20 million in 90. So we had a lot of money over the years, and it gave us a donor base of a couple 100,000 people that was national.
That's a precursor of politicians today using the internet to raise money. It's the same. It's a way to tap into people who aren't the big givers normally.
The internet sort of replaced direct mail.
Yeah.
Republicans had an advantage with direct mail because they got into it earlier and built it stronger. Obama built the internet fundraising. So the Democrats had an advantage in that. Now everybody does it today, but it's sort of replaced direct mail as the small dollar donors. The other big difference, after Watergate back then, nobody could take a check to a camp more than $1,000 in an election. So if you had a primary and you had a general election, the biggest donor would give you $1,000 twice. Well, that's gone. Today, Elon Musk can put $200 million into a super PAC to elect whoever he wants. So that's a big switch.
Let me back up. You mentioned Ronald Reagan, and as you write in your book, the Congressional Club and Senator Helms, Tom Ellis, who you mentioned also, who was a lawyer in Raleigh and one of Helms' first and biggest backers, right? And kind of the brains behind the Congressional Club to start with. You guys were instrumental in Ronald Reagan staying in the race in 1976 when he ran against President Gerald Ford in the primary, the Republican primary. And can you talk about that just a little bit?
Tom Ellis and Jesse were both conservative Democrats for years. And in 70 or 71, both of them switched to Republican, and Jesse ran in the Republican primary. But Jesse was an old-fashioned ideologue, and Tom Ellis was even more so. And Ellis was really the one that wanted Reagan to run for president. After we lost the Vietnam War, they thought we needed somebody that would stand up to build a strong military. And when Reagan announced, and when he came to Raleigh for that dinner, Tom Ellis told him right then, "You run, I'll support you." Mm-hmm. And when he ran, Tom Ellis was his North Carolina campaign chairman. And the people heading up Reagan's national campaign, the head of it was a man named John Sears. He was a nice guy, but he was a lobbyist. He wasn't really a political genius. He was sort of your typical Washington insider. And he started down a road with Reagan's campaign, which was, he's been a great governor. He's a great leader. Vote for the leader we need. And Tom Ellis didn't think that was going to work. He thought you needed to give people reasons to vote for Reagan and not Helms. Like, I'm against détente. We have to win the Cold War. Sears didn't want to say that. And that was a split in Reagan's campaign. And following Sears' strategy, Reagan lost the first 5 primaries, and his campaign was collapsing. And Tom Ellis just split with them and did what he wanted to do in North Carolina, since we were raising most of the money here. And he did a 30-minute film with Reagan talking about mostly defense issues. We've got to win the Cold War. The time's not working. It's like appeasement with the World War II. It didn't work. And that clicked. I remember the first night that ad aired, that 30-minute program there, the telephones in the Congressional Club just erupted. And that was what turned the race around. And all of a sudden, Reagan started gaining on Ford and continued to gain on him and eventually beat him on election night. First campaign Reagan won. And after that happened, Tom Ellis went to Texas, which was the next big primary. And he gave them the ads that we'd done, the TV program, and he got Arthur Finkelstein involved. And we started telling people all over the California, Virginia, here's what we did that worked. And a lot of them did the same thing. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And that was really what turned Reagan's campaign around and made it a horse race going down to the convention.
And that was obviously important for what happened 4 years later. Do you think if Reagan had not won North Carolina that year in 1976, that he would have been president?
Well, you can't know the answer to that, Jim, but it certainly was a key part of it, looking back at what happened. And, people in politics think they really have a lot of sense and a lot of power and a lot of control. When the truth is, as Gary Pierce once told me, they're really like a frog on a log, floating down a river, watching the banks roll past, saying, I've really got this log rolling, and it's not them, it's the river. The real thing that elected Reagan was the river of people who were old World War II veterans who'd been through appeasement and saw détente as the same thing, and it wasn't working. And the really amazing, the surprise that happened at the Republican convention, we had a 4-night convention and we lost on the 3rd night. We fought like crazy, but it didn't work out. Ford won. And then on the 4th night, when Ford gave his speech, after he was finished, Reagan was, sitting up in a box at the convention center. And Ford waved for him to come down and to the podium, and Reagan waved back politely and shook his head. Ford waved again, and people started chanting, "Come down." And Reagan went down stage, and people started chanting, "Speak." Ford pointed to the microphone, and Reagan gave a speech. Now, nobody planned that. Nobody expected that to happen. But I think that speech was the start of Reagan's 1980 campaign. And that we kept him alive and in politics. But that speech was really the spark that started his next election.
Wow.
And it wasn't anything anybody planned. It was just a gift that fell out of the sky.
Well, you guys kept him on the map for that campaign. So let me ask you about Senator Helms, because you worked for him for a long time, and yet you don't have many good things to say about him in this book. You called him, quote, a first-class demagogue, and you once said that he, quote, that you once took Jesse at his word, but looking back, I was wrong. You said he had a streak of sloth. When did your opinion change about him?
Well, I worked with Jesse for over 20 years. And when I started, I was in my early 20s. And he was a complicated, mixed character. He had some good virtues and he had some vices. And after working with him for 20 years, he did have a lazy streak. He did have an ideology that did good at some points, but at other times he turned into a politician. And after we worked together for 20 years, he and Tom Ellis and I were sort of all wore out on each other. And, Jesse and Tom Ellis would sometimes go for months without speaking. They get mad at each other, and I'm sort of the middleman in that equation, where Tom Ellis would call me and say, "Call Jesse and tell him this." Like Jesse would call me and say, "I find out what Tom Ellis thinks about that," but they wouldn't speak to each other. And Tom Ellis, to his credit, was always honest, always straight ahead. Jesse could be sort of duplicitous and manipulative and play games. So he had some good side and a bad side.
You write that in 1992, and this is where it didn't end well for you all. That you said you got a call from a secretary of the Congressional Club who said Jesse had yelled at her and bullied her, basically about a certain fundraising letter, and you called him and accused him of bullying her.
Yeah.
And he demanded an apology. Is that sort of where it ended? I know there was another incident later at some time, but was that the beginning of the end?
What happened? I had a lady that worked for me who was a fantastic lady. She's very nice, very smart. And I left Raleigh to go to my wife's brother's wedding. And when I got up to Northern Virginia where he lived, I called the office, and this woman was almost in tears. And Jesse had called her and berated her because I'd sent out a fundraising letter that he'd never signed. Now, that wasn't true. I had the letter with his initials on the top where he'd approved it. And at that point, I was just wore out with the whole thing. And I called him and said, "Look, what kind of man treats a woman that way? You did approve that letter. You got to call her and apologize." And he hung up. That was the first time he and I stopped speaking. And after that, we didn't speak for, I don't know, a year. And then his daughter, Jane, was a principal at the school at our church. They had a St. Timothy's school. And the pastor who'd hired her retired. It was an Episcopal church. He had to retire at 72. And they kept him on as head of the school, and he and Jane had a row. And so the church board, the vestry, and I was on it, voted to suspend both of them with pay and let them go at the end of the year. And Jesse called Tom Ellis and said, "What are you doing to my daughter?" And Tom Ellis said, "Look, I can't go against my minister." And that was really the last chapter of the whole saga. But
Was that before the 96 campaign?
it was, yeah.
Okay, so you guys were not involved in that
Would have
campaign
been
then?
in 94. I didn't get involved at all in 96. I think Tom Ellis may have a little bit, but not a great deal. But 96 was a rerun of 90. The opponent was the same person.
Charlotte Mayor Harvey Gantt,
Yeah.
former Charlotte Mayor.
Yeah. Wasn't really anything new in 96 compared to 90. But yeah, by then I had parted ways with Jesse completely.
Let me go back to that race and even a little bit earlier. You talk about the use of race in the book a lot in campaigns, and not just with Helms, because in that 76 primary, Gerald Ford had said some good things about Massachusetts Senator Edward Brooke, who was black, that he would make a good vice president. And then you guys, Tom Ellis, came out with a flyer with pictures of Ford and Brooke and a caption that said, Ed Brooke supports forced busing to you.
Yeah.
And then in the 1990 campaign against Harvey Gantt, who was black, still is, there was an ad that got a lot of attention, even though it didn't run for a long time. It showed a pair of white hands crumpling a job rejection letter while the narrator said, you needed that job, but they had to give it to a minority because of a racial quota. Is that really fair? Harvey Gantt says it is. And then Jesse denied that it was racist at all or racial, but you told the reporter, and you write this in the book, you told a reporter that it was the race card. I just wondered if you could talk about that, because you later said that you described kind of a poignant meeting with some black Tuckasegee airmen and tell them that you wouldn't have done that either.
Well, what happened? Race was always an issue in Southern politics and in campaigns. And when I started out in the 70s, there were lines you couldn't cross without offending voters. But on the other hand, if you stayed on the right side of the line and played it safer, you could make race an issue. And that was what the Brooke ad did. It didn't attack Brooke for being black. It attacked him for Ford and Brooke for being for busing. But that also touched the race card. We put his picture on there. But it didn't create a backlash among voters because they looked at that and said, okay, well, that's okay. What happened with the white hands ad, and I saw that as sort of the same way. It didn't cross the line into being a blatantly racist attack. So when we did it in 90, I was okay doing it. But the fact is we were tapping the racial nerve, and it didn't work. We only aired it for 4 or 5 days. We were polling every fourth night. The poll came back and it was a flop. People didn't really care about the quotas issue. But I don't know, years later, I became friends with a black man in Raleigh who was a retired Air Force sergeant. And he'd come out to my office and he'd sit and he loved to tell stories. And one night he sitting across the table from me and he said, a friend told me you did that white hands ad. And I thought, oh, Lord. And I said, yeah, I did. And I explained to him that Gantt had attacked Jesse for voting against Ted Kennedy's civil rights bill, and it included racial quotas. And that was why we did it, to answer that attack. And he nodded and he said, okay. And he left. And the next day he came back and he brought 3 Tuskegee airmen with him. And of course, they were old and white haired by then. And he said, these 3 men joined the Army Air Force, fought for their country at a time when they weren't allowed to vote. And he said, that's what I call patriotism. And when I saw that ad through those 3 black veterans' eyes, I thought that was wrong. We shouldn't have done that. And it wasn't a couple of months after that, a reporter interviewed Jesse, and then he came to Raleigh and interviewed me. And he asked Jesse, was that a racist ad? Jesse gave the standard response, no, it wasn't. When he came to see me, he asked me about it. I said, yeah, it was. I wouldn't do that again. And he was shocked. He wasn't expecting that answer. But that's how I feel about it. It's not that it crossed some sort of a line that the public had. But when I saw it through those three black veterans' eyes, I thought that was a bad thing to do.
We have to wrap up soon, but I wanted to ask you, for a guy who's made a career in politics and, write a blog called Talking About Politics, you don't have a lot of good things to say about it. It seems like you say politics is a mean, vicious world. You wrote that elections are brutal and unforgiving, and conventions are snake pits. So how do you look at politics today?
Well, Jim, the way I look at it is we live in a fallen world. And it's never going to be noble or virtuous on its own. Really, the foundation for improvement is religion. And Reagan was uniquely religious. There was a story about Reagan after he was assassinated. He was
attempted assassination.
The attempted assassination, yeah, not killed, but wounded. And he was laying in the emergency room, and he heard somebody say Jim Brady had been killed or was dying. And Reagan said a prayer for Brady. And then he heard somebody talking about the guy that shot him, and they said, he was sick. He was mentally disjointed. And Reagan thought, I can't pray the Lord save me if I don't say a prayer for that boy.
Mm.
So he said a prayer for the man that shot him. That's a rare thing.
Yeah.
And religion is the thing that will pull us out of the mess of the fallen world. Reagan had it uniquely. And I think that the decline in religious values is a big part. Politics doesn't really shape people, it reflects them. And what I see in politics today says to me that as a people, we've rolled downhill, and I attribute that to the decline in religion.
I wonder if you could explain the title of your book, which is called The Trail of the Serpent, and tell people where they can get it.
Well, I'll tell you where you can get it first. The easiest way is just to order it on Amazon. Everybody I've talked to, they got it in a couple of days. There's a poem by an Irish poet named Thomas Moore. And he has a line in the poem, "Some flowers of Eden we will inherit, but the trail of the serpent is over them all." And when I looked at politics, I saw some flowers of Eden, like Bob Harris, Tom Ellis, Reagan story I told you about him.
Mm-hmm.
But I also saw the trail of the serpent over it all. And that was why I used that title.
Well, Carter, it was an interesting book, and thank you for writing it, and thank you for sharing all this stuff on the podcast. And I have to say, Carter, thanks again.
Thank you, Jim, and I wish you the best.
You too. Thank you so much. To our listeners, thank you for listening, and you can find more about the Charlotte Ledger by going to thecharlotteledger.com. And this episode was produced by Lindsay Banks.
QueenCityPodcastNetwork.com.